I walked into the Navy briefing room, and the Admiral joked, "What's your call sign, princess?" Everyone laughed until I replied, "Reaper Zero." His expression changed immediately. He knew exactly who I was. Can you imagine being called princess in front of 40 high-ranking officers, a snide jab meant to diminish you, to remind you that you didn't belong? And in that same breath, watching the man who said it realize, with dawning horror, that he just publicly mocked the living legend he himself revered, the room froze. And in that terrifying, exhilarating silence, I knew my life, and his, would never be the same. Have you ever felt that shockwave of comeuppance, when someone who completely underestimated you suddenly understood exactly who they were dealing with? The story begins. For years, I believed confidence spoke for itself. I'm Lieutenant Commander Sandra Kane, 32 years old, and the night I earned my call sign, Reaper Zero, was a night everyone else called impossible. I worked harder, flew longer, and stayed silent while others took credit, even when respect was clearly withheld. I just kept my head down and did the work. It was how I was raised. My family was military through and through. Discipline came before breakfast, literally. My dad, a Navy mechanic, taught me to take apart an engine before I learned to drive. My mom would joke I saluted before I spoke. Our house always smelled of motor oil and freshly pressed uniforms. Dinner was all deployment schedules and maintenance protocols. I learned early that precision mattered, that shortcuts got people killed, and that respect? You earned that through action, not empty words. By 17, I was pushing myself harder than most recruits twice my age. 5 miles before school, weekends at the firing range, flight manuals instead of magazines. My friends thought I was obsessed, and maybe I was. But the Navy wasn't just a goal, it was an inheritance. My grandfather served in Vietnam. My father spent 20 years keeping jets airborne. This was the family trade, and I was born into it. I joined the Special Operations Aviation Unit straight out of flight school. We were the quiet wings that worked alongside SEALs, getting teams in and out, no matter the weather, terrain, or utter chaos. We flew low and fast, hugging ground that would make commercial pilots sick. We landed in places not on any map, picked up men whose names we'd never know, and vanished before anyone even realized we'd been there. It was dangerous, bone-deep work that demanded absolute focus and a kind of nerve most people just don't possess. My call sign, Reaper Zero, wasn't earned in some simulator. It came from a night in Kandahar. A storm hit that grounded every other pilot. The wind was tearing our forward operating base apart, visibility was near zero, and a SEAL team was pinned down 12 miles out, casualties mounting. Command had already written them off. Too risky, they said. Weather's too bad. We'll extract at first light. But first light meant body bags. Everyone knew it. I volunteered. My co-pilot, a quiet guy named Alvarez, didn't hesitate. We pre-flighted the bird in horizontal rain, strapped in, and lifted off into conditions that violated every safety protocol in the book. The flight out was pure hell. Wind shear nearly flipped us twice. Zero visibility, navigating by instruments and raw instinct. When we found them, they were surrounded, taking fire from 3 sides, down to their last magazines. We came in hot, rotors screaming, and held position while they loaded the wounded. Tracers lit up the darkness around us. I felt rounds punch through the fuselage. Alvarez called out damage reports in a voice that never shook. We got them out. All of them. The flight back was even worse. Overloaded, losing hydraulic pressure, engine temperature redlining. I nursed that bird home on sheer discipline and stubbornness, landed her hard on the tarmac, and shut down before the mechanics even started shouting about the damage. The team leader, a grizzled master chief, found me in the hangar an hour later. He didn't say much, just shook my hand and said, "You're Reaper Zero now." The name stuck. I built my reputation in silence. The men respected me because I didn't ask for it. I just did the work. I showed up early, stayed late, and never made excuses. I flew missions others turned down. I studied tactics until I could predict enemy movements better than intelligence analysts. I maintained my aircraft personally, learning every system, every quirk, every sound that meant something was wrong. Competence was my currency, and I spent it carefully. But as I moved up the ranks, so did the noise around me. Command politics, egos, and the unspoken rule that a woman had to prove herself twice as hard to be considered half as capable. Meetings where my input was ignored until a male officer repeated it verbatim. Evaluations that praised my attention to detail but questioned my command presence. The subtle implication that I was good for a woman, not just good. I learned to navigate it, stay professional, document everything, let results speak louder than complaints. Still, I stayed focused. I truly believe the mission came before pride. The men I flew with didn't care about my gender when bullets were flying. They cared that I could land in a hot zone without flinching, that I knew their tactics better than they did, that I'd fly through hell to bring them home. That was enough for me. Or, at least, that's what I told myself. I'd built walls around the disrespect, compartmentalized it, filed it away as the cost of doing business in a man's world. Chief Warrant Officer Miller, our senior flight mechanic, became something like a mentor. He was old-school Navy, tattooed and gruff, 40 years of service and zero patience for incompetence. He treated me exactly like he treated everyone else, with demanding standards and brutal honesty. When I made mistakes, he told me. When I did good work, he grunted approval and moved on. That equity meant more to me than any official commendation. "You're solid," he told me once after a particularly difficult mission, our hands covered in grease, the smell of jet fuel thick in the air. "Don't let the noise get to you. Just keep flying." I took that advice seriously. I kept my head down, focused on the work, and ignored the comments that came my way. The jokes about whether I could handle the physical demands. The questions about whether I'd gotten preferential treatment. The nickname some of the newer guys used when they thought I couldn't hear, Princess. I let it slide. We were soldiers. Teasing was currency. I'd heard worse. I'd survived worse. But looking back now, I wonder if my silence was strength or simply surrender. If by not calling it out, I'd given permission for it to continue. If the walls I built to protect myself had actually just made me smaller. That belief, that loyalty to the mission meant accepting disrespect as part of the package, would be tested in ways I didn't see coming. Because respect and competence should never have been separate currencies. And the moment I truly realized that, everything changed. The first real red flag came wrapped in a joke. "You sure you can handle night ops, ma'am? That storm might mess up your mascara." Laughter followed. We were in the ready room, prepping for a joint training exercise. The comment came from a new SEAL lieutenant, fresh from Coronado, still young enough to think bravado was the same as confidence. I brushed it off. But something about the laughter felt different this time. Sharper. More pointed. Over time, it shifted. My calls went ignored in joint briefings. My reports were reviewed twice when others weren't. I'd submit flight plans that were returned with questions that bordered on insulting from analysts who'd never sat in a cockpit. Meanwhile, identical plans from male pilots sailed through without comment. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts, each one small enough to seem paranoid if I complained, but collectively heavy enough to slow me down. Then a new SEAL commander, Admiral Nathan Cole, took over the Joint Task Force 6 months into my posting. He arrived with a reputation that preceded him, charismatic, loud, all confidence, the kind of officer who commanded through personality rather than policy. His teams loved him. He ran briefings like a football coach, all motivational speeches and backslapping camaraderie. He had an infectious energy that filled rooms and made men want to follow him into danger. But something about his leadership style made me uneasy. He'd shake hands with every man in the room, then glance past me like I was part of the furniture. During briefings, he'd make eye contact with male officers when they spoke, but check his watch when I gave updates. He'd call me Princess when we debriefed. Sweetheart when I questioned tactics. Never my rank, never my name, just diminutives that reduced me from pilot to a pretty girl playing dress-up. "Princess here thinks we should adjust the extraction timeline," he said once during a joint planning session. The words were wrapped in a smile, but the message was clear. My input was cute, not critical. The other officers chuckled. I felt my jaw tighten but kept my expression neutral. Stay professional, I told myself. Let performance do the talking, but there was something deeper, an undercurrent I couldn't quite identify. He watched me sometimes with an expression that wasn't quite hostility, but definitely not respect either. Something closer to resentment. During mission debriefs, when I'd present after-action analyses, he'd interrupt with anecdotes about how SEALs used to do things, how extraction tactics had worked in his day, how maybe pilots should stick to flying and let ground commanders handle strategy. I asked around quietly. Lieutenant Alvarez, my co-pilot, had heard rumors. Word is Cole lost 2 men years ago during a failed extraction. He told me one evening in the hangar as we ran maintenance checks, the familiar rhythm of tools and diagnostics filling the space. Bad weather, enemy contact, pilot couldn't hold position. The team had to extract on foot through hostile territory. 2 didn't make it. 1 was maybe 5, 6 years ago, before your time. But here's the thing, the mission logs were redacted, classified. No one talks about it, but supposedly it looked a lot like the kind of ops you run. I felt something cold, subtle, in my chest. Did he request the redaction? Alvarez shrugged. Don't know, but he's been weird about aviation support ever since. Doesn't trust pilots. Especially not. He trailed off. Especially not women, I finished. He nodded. Yeah, it explains some things. Not all, but some. If Cole blamed pilot error for losing his men, if he'd spent years carrying that grief and anger, then my presence, my success in the exact kind of missions that had failed him, would be a daily reminder of his failure. I represented everything he couldn't control, couldn't predict, couldn't dominate through force of personality. But understanding his motivation didn't make the disrespect any easier to swallow. During a joint exercise in the Nevada desert, I executed a perfect extraction under simulated fire. Hostile terrain, tight timeline, zero margin for error. I brought the team out exactly on schedule, with textbook precision. During the debrief, Cole spent 15 minutes critiquing my approach angle and questioning whether I'd put the team at unnecessary risk by prioritizing speed over caution. With respect, sir, I said, keeping my voice level. Speed was the mission requirement. The scenario called for rapid extraction under enemy fire. Caution would have meant casualties. Scenarios aren't reality, princess, he shot back. Real combat is messy. You can't just fly in like some kind of action hero and expect everything to work out. The room went quiet. I felt every eye on me, waiting to see how I'd respond. I could have argued. Could have pointed out that I'd flown more combat missions than half his team combined, that my scenarios had been real bullets and real blood, that Reaper Zero wasn't a participation trophy. But I didn't. Because arguing would have confirmed everything he wanted to believe, that I was emotional, defensive, not tough enough for this world. Understood, sir, I said instead. He smiled. Victory. I left that debrief feeling something I hadn't felt in years, doubt. Not about my abilities, but about whether competence would ever be enough. Whether any amount of perfect missions, flawless execution, or lives saved would ever override the fact that I didn't fit his image of what a soldier should be. I'd spent my entire career believing that if I just worked hard enough, flew well enough, proved myself thoroughly enough, the respect would follow. But maybe I'd been wrong. Maybe, for some people, I'd always be princess, no matter what I did. It happened on a Tuesday. Joint training brief in Norfolk. A room full of officers, analysts, and brass, maybe 40 people total, seated in rows facing a projector screen. Standard professional development session on coordinating air and ground operations. I walked in early, uniform pressed, boots shined, ready to discuss new flight protocols. The Admiral was already there, leaning against the table at the front of the room, arms crossed, smirk ready. He was talking with a cluster of SEAL officers, their conversation loud and easy, the kind of camaraderie that comes from shared danger and mutual respect. I took a seat near the middle, pulled out my notepad and reviewed my notes. Just another day, just another briefing. The room filled quickly. Officers filed in, claimed seats, chatted in low voices. I recognized most of them, people I'd worked with on various ops, flown for, coordinated with. Commander Reeves, who ran logistics for the East Coast SEAL teams, nodded at me from across the room. Captain Lawson, a senior intelligence officer I'd worked with in Afghanistan, gave me a subtle smile. Normal professional courtesy, nothing unusual. The briefing started on schedule. Reeves ran through updated protocols, discussed new equipment allocations, reviewed after-action reports from recent training exercises, standard stuff. Then came the introductions. Each senior officer taking a moment to identify themselves and their role for the benefit of newer personnel. When it was my turn, I stood. Lieutenant Commander Sandra Kane, Special Operations Aviation stationed. Hold on. Admiral Cole's voice cut through the room like a knife. He pushed off the table, that familiar smirk spreading across his face. The room went quiet. Before we start, what's your call sign, princess? Laughter rippled through the room. Not from everyone, but enough. The kind of laughter that makes your throat tighten, that tells you you're the joke, not in on it. I felt the heat rise in my face, but kept my expression neutral. This was a test. Everything with Cole was a test. I paused, studied his face. He thought he was being clever, putting me on the spot, diminishing me in front of senior leadership, reminding everyone that I didn't quite belong. The laughter continued, a few officers shifting uncomfortably, others grinning like this was prime entertainment. Reaper Zero, I said. My voice was steady, clear, carrying across the room without strain. The laughter stopped. Just like that. Cut off mid-breath. The Admiral froze, the color draining from his face. His smirk vanished, replaced by something I'd never seen before. Recognition. Shock. York, he started, but didn't finish. Couldn't finish. Because Reaper Zero was classified, known only through mission reports. The pilot who extracted SEAL Team 9 from the Helmand Ridge under fire after command had written them off as lost. The operation that every SEAL officer studied, that had become required viewing in advanced tactical training, tagged simply as unknown female operator. The mission where impossible odds had been beaten by skill, nerve, and a pilot who refused to accept that some men were expendable. I watched the realization hit him. Saw the exact moment he connected the dots, when the anonymous hero from the classified footage became the woman he'd been dismissing for months. His team, the men he'd lost years ago in that failed extraction, they had been part of the broader task force operating in Helmand Province. Different op, different timeline, but same theater, same conditions, same impossible odds. The difference was, their pilot hadn't made it through. I had. He'd mocked the very person who had saved his men years ago, or at least men from units he'd served alongside, in operations that looked just like the one that had cost him people he cared about. And he realized it too late, in front of everyone. The room was absolutely silent now. Captain Lawson leaned forward in his seat, eyes sharp with recognition. He'd been the intelligence officer who'd processed the after-action reports from Hellman Ridge. He knew exactly what Reaper Zero meant. Commander Reeves was staring at me like he'd never seen me before, which, in a way, he hadn't. Not really. None of them had. The Hellman Ridge extraction, Lawson said quietly. That was you. It wasn't a question. I nodded once. Jesus Christ, someone muttered from the back of the room. Admiral Cole still hadn't moved. His face had gone from red to white to something gray and stricken. His hands, which had been casually crossed over his chest, now hung at his sides. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. I didn't. He started. The reports never. The reports were classified, sir, I said evenly. Names redacted for operational security. Standard protocol for special operations personnel. Another long silence. I could feel the weight of 40 pairs of eyes on me, reassessing, recalculating. Seeing me completely differently than they had 5 minutes ago. The quiet pilot who did her job and didn't make waves was suddenly the legend they'd watched on grainy cockpit footage. The one who'd done the impossible when everyone else had said it couldn't be done. Commander Reeves cleared his throat. Perhaps we should continue with the briefing. It was a lifeline, a way to move past the moment, to let everyone pretend this hadn't just happened. But I knew better. This wasn't something you moved past. This was a revelation that would follow me, follow Cole, follow everyone in this room for the rest of our careers. Admiral Cole finally found his voice. Commander Kane, Lieutenant Commander, I corrected quietly. And yes, we should continue, sir. The briefing. I sat down. The room stayed silent for another beat. Then Reeves resumed talking, his voice a bit too loud, a bit too forced. The briefing continued, but no one was really listening. I could feel the whispers building like pressure before a storm. By the time we broke for lunch, the story would be everywhere. Admiral Nathan Cole, the charismatic SEAL commander who ran his teams like a fraternity, had just publicly humiliated himself by mocking a pilot whose reputation eclipsed his own. And worse, by revealing that he didn't know the legends in his own field, that he let prejudice blind him to competence, that his judgment was flawed in the most fundamental way. I sat through the rest of the briefing, taking notes, asking relevant questions, acting like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The man who'd spent months diminishing me now couldn't meet my eyes, and everyone else couldn't stop looking at me with a mixture of awe and discomfort, like they'd discovered they'd been sharing a room with someone famous and hadn't realized it. When the briefing finally ended, I gathered my materials and headed for the door. Officers stepped aside to let me pass, some nodding with newfound respect, others just staring. I didn't acknowledge any of it. I just walked out, head high, stride steady, exactly like I'd walked in. But as I stepped into the corridor, I heard Captain Lawson's voice behind me, pitched low, but carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. She's that Reaper. The one from Ridge. Holy hell. Words spread faster than gunfire. By evening, the story had reached every corner of the base. By the next morning, it was in 3 other commands. The Admiral didn't speak to me for weeks, which was fine. We had nothing to say to each other. But whispers followed me down every hallway, in every mess hall, every ready room I entered. She's that Reaper, the one from Ridge. Holy hell, I watched that footage in training. She flew through that? No way. Command wrote those guys off. She brought them all home. For years, I'd fought for respect with steady confidence, proving myself one mission at a time, building credibility through consistency and results. Now I had respect. Immediate, overwhelming, unquestioned. But it felt hollow. It wasn't admiration for the work I'd been doing every day for years. It was fear and guilt twisted together, all mixed with discomfort, the uncomfortable realization that they'd been wrong about me in ways they couldn't ignore anymore. The younger officers started treating me differently. They'd straighten up when I passed, address me with careful formality, ask my opinion on tactics like my words were scripture. Some of the senior officers, the ones who'd ignored me in meetings, questioned my reports, smiled at Cole's jokes, now went out of their way to be respectful. Too respectful. The kind of overcorrection that tells you they know they screwed up and are desperately trying to fix it. I hated it. Not because it wasn't validating, it was. But because it proved something I'd been trying not to believe, that my competence had never been the issue. That I could fly 1,000 perfect missions and it wouldn't matter as much as one dramatic reveal. That respect had always been available. They just hadn't thought I deserved it until my legend became impossible to ignore. Lieutenant Alvarez found me in the hangar 3 nights after the briefing. I was sitting on the deck beside our bird, running my hands along the panel where we'd taken fire over Kandahar. The patched holes were smooth now, barely visible, but I knew exactly where each one was. You okay? He asked. Fine. You're a terrible liar. I smiled despite myself. I'm great at lying. I've been lying about being okay for years. He sat down beside me, back against the landing gear. Everyone's talking about you. I noticed. They're saying you're a legend. I'm not. I'm just a pilot who got lucky one night and did her job. That's not what the after-action reports say. Lawson pulled them, well, the unclassified summaries. 0 visibility, sustained enemy fire, mechanical failures, overweight bird. Pilots with twice your experience refuse the mission. You made 3 trips, Kane. 3. Got everyone out, including 2 guys who were bleeding out. The doctor said if you'd been 15 minutes later, they wouldn't have made it. I remembered that night in flashes. The sound of rotors screaming against the wind, Alvarez's voice steady in my headset, the weight of wounded men being loaded while tracers cut through the darkness, the certainty that we weren't going to make it, and the stubborn refusal to accept that certainty as fact. I did what anyone would have done, I said. No. You did what no one else could do. There's a difference. We sat in silence for a while. The hangar was quiet this time of night, just the distant hum of base operations, the occasional footsteps of security patrols. Finally, Alvarez said, "You know what bothers me most about all this?" "What?" "That they needed the call sign. That your work wasn't enough. That it took some classified legend to make them see what was right in front of them the whole time." He'd put words to the exact thing I'd been trying not to think. I thought about every time I'd let Princess slide. Every time I'd smiled instead of called it out. Every time I'd absorbed disrespect and filed it away as the cost of doing business. Maybe I'd trained them to think it was acceptable. That I'd accept anything as long as I could keep flying. I should have said something earlier, I said. Should have pushed back, maybe. Or maybe they should have treated you like the professional you were from day one. Regardless of what call sign you carried or what missions you'd flown. Maybe they should have judged you by the work you did every single day, not by one dramatic story. He was right. I knew he was right. But knowing it didn't make the hollow feeling go away. I spent the next few evenings in the hangar, sitting beside the bird that had carried me through those missions, running pre-flight checks I didn't need to run, reviewing maintenance logs that were already perfect. Chief Miller found me there one night, carrying coffee in 2 paper cups. "You're hiding," he said, handing me one. "I'm working." "You're hiding," he repeated. "Don't blame you. It's a circus out there." I took a sip. Black. No sugar. Exactly how I liked it. I don't know how to feel about any of this. Feel however you feel. That's allowed. For years, I thought if I just kept my head down and did good work, that would be enough. Turns out it wasn't. It took a dramatic reveal in front of 40 people to get respect I should have had all along. What does that say? Miller settled onto a toolbox, his weathered face thoughtful. Says people are stupid. Says they believe what they want to believe until reality smacks them in the face. But here's the thing, Kane. You always had my respect. Always had the respect of everyone who actually worked with you. The people who flew with you, maintained your bird, relied on you to bring them home. We knew. The ones who didn't know weren't paying attention. Cole wasn't paying attention. Cole was paying attention to all the wrong things. His problem, not yours. He lost men, Miller. Years ago. Failed extraction. Bad weather. I heard about that bad business. But that still doesn't excuse him treating you like you were incompetent. You didn't fail his men. Some other pilot did. Or maybe nobody failed. Maybe it was just bad luck and worse circumstances. Either way, taking it out on you is garbage leadership. You don't have to prove anything anymore, Alvarez had told me earlier. But he was wrong. It wasn't about proof. It was about reclaiming the story. Not as the nameless savior, not as the novelty woman in uniform, but as a soldier who earned her place the same way anyone else did, through work, through consistency, through competence, demonstrated every single day. The call sign was just a name. The respect it commanded was built on one night, one mission, one impossible situation. But I'd flown hundreds of missions. I'd trained dozens of pilots. I'd coordinated countless operations that went perfectly because I'd done my homework, anticipated problems, and executed with precision. That work mattered. That work was me. I couldn't control how people saw me. Couldn't force them to recognize competence when prejudice was easier. But I could control how I saw myself. And I was done shrinking. Done accepting Princess as the price of admission. Done pretending that disrespect was somehow separate from the work. "I'm requesting reassignment," I told Miller. He raised an eyebrow. "Where to?" "Joint command position, fleet operations. Leadership role. That'll put you in Cole's chain of command." "Not for long. I'm going around him." Miller smiled. A rare sight. About time. When promotion boards opened, I submitted my record without shortcuts. No endorsements, no favors, just my service history, my mission reports, my qualifications. I requested reassignment to a joint command position directly under fleet operations. That meant bypassing Cole entirely, going above his head to the regional command structure where decisions were made by admirals who didn't care about task force politics. The paperwork went through channels. I waited. Command positions didn't open often, and competition was fierce. But I had something most candidates didn't, a service record that spoke for itself, once you bothered to read it. And now, thanks to that briefing room reveal, people were reading it. 2 weeks later, Cole called me in. His office was exactly what you'd expect. Walls covered in commendations, photos of SEAL teams in exotic locations, challenge coins from various units displayed behind glass. He was sitting behind his desk when I entered, looking older than I remembered. The swagger diminished. "You requested a transfer," he said. No preamble, no small talk. "Yes, sir. Joint command position. You think you can lead SEALs?" He said it quietly, without the usual edge, like he genuinely wanted to know. "I don't know, sir, but I think I can coordinate aviation support for special operations better than anyone else you've got. That's the position I'm applying for. You think they'll follow you?" I met his eyes. They already did. Silence. He looked down at his desk, at a folder that I recognized as my service jacket. He'd been reading it, probably for the first time, actually paying attention. I could see the moment it hit him. The sheer weight of missions, the consistency of results, the steady upward trajectory of increasing responsibility and flawless execution. "Hellman Ridge," he said finally. "You brought out Team 9. All of them?" "Yes, sir. I lost 2 men in a similar op 3 years before that. Failed extraction. Bad weather. Pilot couldn't hold position. Team had to move on foot through hostile territory. Johnson and Peters didn't make it. I'm sorry for your loss, sir." He nodded slowly. I blamed the pilot. Spent years thinking if we just had someone better, someone tougher, someone willing to push through the impossible conditions, maybe my men would have come home. Maybe, I said, or maybe that pilot did everything humanly possible, and it still wasn't enough. Missions fail sometimes, not because of incompetence, but because the odds are impossible and luck runs out. But you made it through. I got lucky. The wind shifted at exactly the right moment. My co-pilot was exceptional. The team leader kept his head. A dozen things could have gone wrong and didn't. I was good, sir, but I was also fortunate. He looked at me for a long moment. "You're being modest." "I'm being honest. Good outcomes require skill and luck. I had both that night. Other pilots, equally skilled, have had neither. That doesn't make them failures. It makes them human." He closed the folder. "I tried to block your transfer. Called some people, made some arguments about unit cohesion and operational disruption. You should know that." "I figured you would, sir." But the paperwork went above me. When the review committee saw Reaper 0 on the classified side of your record, doors opened. I couldn't close. "Captain Lawson advocated for you. So did Commander Reeves. Apparently you've made quite an impression." I didn't respond. Just waited. "I got a reprimand," he continued. "Conduct unbecoming. Nothing career-ending, but it's in my file now. Admiral Chin, my boss, pulled me in and explained in detail exactly how badly I'd screwed up. Called my behavior a failure of leadership and inconsistent with Navy values." He paused. He wasn't wrong. "Sir, no, let me finish." He stood up, came around the desk, but didn't get too close. "I let grief and frustration turn into resentment. Took it out on you because you represented everything I couldn't control. Couldn't predict. Couldn't dominate through force of personality. You were good at exactly the thing that failed me. And instead of respecting that, I tried to diminish it. That was wrong. You deserved better. The mission deserved better." It was the most honest I'd ever heard him. No swagger, no jokes, just a man confronting his own failures. Part of me wanted to accept the apology and move on. Part of me was still angry. "You called me princess in front of 40 officers," I said quietly. "Made me a joke. Made them think I was incompetent when I'd spent years proving otherwise. Do you have any idea how hard I've worked to be taken seriously? How many times I've swallowed disrespect because calling it out would just confirm that I'm too sensitive, too emotional, not tough enough for this world. I know. And I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't fix it. The damage is done. Those officers, some of them, will always remember me as the joke you made, regardless of what they learned after." He nodded. "You're right. I can undo it. But I can promise it won't happen again. Not from me, and not from anyone in my command if I can help it." I wanted to believe him. Wanted to think people could change, that one moment of public humiliation could teach the lesson that years of competence hadn't. But I'd been in the military long enough to know that words were easy and follow-through was rare. "We'll see," I said. "Your transfer is approved. You'll be reassigned to fleet operations within 60 days. Joint command position coordinating aviation support across all East Coast Special Operations units. It's a promotion. Not in rank yet, but in responsibility. You'll be leading the aviation planning for major operations." "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me. I fought it. You earned it despite me. Not because of me." I left his office feeling something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction exactly, but resolution. Cole got a reprimand, but he kept his post. His influence would be diminished, his reputation tarnished, but he'd survive. Maybe that was enough. Maybe accountability didn't always mean destruction. Sometimes it just meant consequences and the chance to do better. Leadership without integrity corrodes the mission. I'd seen it play out in real time, watched how one man's unchecked prejudice had poisoned the environment for months. But I'd also seen the system, flawed as it was, eventually correct itself, slowly and imperfectly, but correct nonetheless. As I walked across the base toward the hangar, I passed groups of junior officers in conversation. Some of them straightened when they saw me, offered respectful nods. Others just stared, probably still processing the story that had become base legend. I acknowledged them with quiet professionalism and kept walking. This new position would be different. More authority, more visibility, more pressure, but also more opportunity to shape how operations were run, how pilots were evaluated, how competence was recognized, regardless of who embodied it. I'd be in a position to advocate for others the way no one had advocated for me, to make sure that the next young pilot, male or female, wouldn't have to earn their respect through one dramatic reveal, but would be judged fairly from day one based on the work they did. That thought carried me forward through the doubt and the hollow feeling and the lingering anger. Not revenge, not vindication, just the possibility that I could make the system a little bit better, a little bit fairer than it had been for me. Command was different. Every decision was a test, not of tactics, but of how much space I was allowed to take. The position put me in charge of coordinating aviation support for special operations across the entire East Coast Theater. I interfaced with SEAL teams, Marine Force Recon, Army Special Forces, coordinating insertions, extractions, air support, and emergency response. The scope was massive, the responsibility intense, and the scrutiny constant. Some men still hesitated when I gave orders. Not the pilots. They knew aviation and respected competence. But some ground commanders would pause before executing my instructions, that subtle delay that said they needed a moment to override their instincts to accept that this woman's orders were legitimate. I learned to recognize it, to address it directly without being confrontational. Problem with the flight plan, Captain? I'd ask, voice neutral. No, ma'am. Just confirming the details. The details are in your brief. If something's unclear, ask now. We execute in 20 minutes. Direct. No room for hesitation. Most of them adjusted quickly. A few never quite got comfortable with it, but they followed orders anyway, because the results were undeniable. Within 6 months, I coordinated 2 successful extraction ops in conflict zones others had refused to touch. The first was a humanitarian rescue in Somalia. Medical team pinned down by militia forces, local air support compromised, weather deteriorating fast. Every other command had said it was too risky. I analyzed the terrain, coordinated with an Air Force combat controller on the ground, and designed a flight approach that used the terrain to mask our approach vector. We got in low, fast, and dirty, extracted 14 people under fire, and were gone before the militia could organize effective resistance. The second operation was a SEAL team extraction from a compromised position in Syria. Intelligence failure had put them in a hot zone with enemy forces closing from 3 sides. Traditional extraction routes were blocked. I coordinated a multi-aircraft approach, decoy helicopters drawing fire while the primary bird came in from an unexpected angle. We pulled them out with 0 casualties. The team leader, a commander I'd never met before, shook my hand afterward and said, "That was textbook." Better than textbook. The call sign Reaper 0 stopped being a ghost story and became a standard. New pilots studied my mission plans. Training scenarios incorporated my tactics. Flight schools analyzed my decision-making process during Helmand Ridge and used it to teach crisis management. The legend that had once been anonymous was now attached to my name, and with it came a credibility that opened doors I'd previously had to fight to crack. But with visibility came vulnerability. Every decision I made was scrutinized more heavily than my peers. When male commanders made judgment calls that didn't work out, it was noted and moved past. When I made similar calls, there were questions about whether I was suited for the position. The double standard was exhausting, but it wasn't new, just applied at a higher level. Cole faded from the forefront during those months. He still commanded his SEAL task force, but our paths rarely crossed. His influence within the special operations community had diminished. Officers who'd once sought his approval now worked around him. Young SEALs coming through training heard about him as a cautionary tale, the commander who let prejudice blind him to competence. Rumor said he'd requested early retirement. Whether that was voluntary or encouraged from above, I didn't know. The irony was quiet, but sharp. The man who mocked my name now carried its shadow everywhere he went. Officers who'd laughed at his jokes in that briefing room now remembered their complicity with embarrassment. Some apologized to me directly. Awkward conversations where they tried to explain that they hadn't really thought it was funny. They'd just gone along. I accepted their apologies without comment. There was no point in relitigating it. The past stayed past. As for me, I learned to wield authority differently, not through fear or anger, but through precision, patience, and example. I led from the front when necessary and from behind when appropriate. I gave credit generously and took responsibility completely. When operations succeeded, I highlighted the pilots and ground teams who executed. When operations failed or came close, I owned the planning and made adjustments. I also made a point of mentoring younger officers, both men and women. I held office hours where junior personnel could come discuss tactics, ask questions, voice concerns. I reviewed their flight plans personally and provided detailed feedback. I advocated for them when promotion boards came around, writing recommendations based purely on competence and potential. A young female pilot, Ensign Harper, became something of a protege. She reminded me of myself at that age, hungry to prove herself, working twice as hard, swallowing disrespect because she didn't know she had other options. After watching her endure a series of dismissive comments from a senior logistics officer, I pulled her aside. "You don't have to accept that," I told her. "It's just how it is, ma'am. If I make waves, they'll think I'm difficult. If you stay silent, they'll think disrespect is acceptable. There's a balance. You don't have to tolerate everything, but you do have to choose your battles carefully. Document incidents. Build your case. Then, when you push back, you're doing it from a position of strength." She looked uncertain. "Is that what you did?" "No. I stayed silent too long. Let it build until one moment changed everything. But I'm trying to make it so you don't have to follow that path. You shouldn't need a dramatic reveal to get basic respect. They say you're Reaper Zero, the pilot from Hellman Ridge. I am, but that's one mission from years ago. What matters more is the work I did yesterday, what I'll do tomorrow. The legend opened doors, but competence keeps them open. Remember that." She nodded, and I saw something shift in her expression. Determination replacing resignation. A few weeks later, I heard she'd formally reported the logistics officer for unprofessional conduct. The complaint was upheld. The officer received counseling. Small victory, but meaningful. I realized that this, creating space for the next generation to be treated fairly from the start, was more important than any individual mission I'd fly. Leadership wasn't just about executing operations. It was about shaping culture, setting standards, demonstrating through action that competence mattered more than demographics. But the work was slow. Changing institutional culture was like trying to redirect a river. You couldn't do it all at once. You had to move one stone at a time until the current shifted. Some days felt like progress. Others felt like fighting gravity. I learned to measure success in small increments. A junior officer given a fair evaluation, a pilot promoted based purely on merit, a briefing room where gender never became part of the conversation. Chief Miller visited me in my new office one afternoon, looking around at the sparse decoration, my commendations on one wall, a photo of my old bird on the desk, nothing else. "Settling in?" he asked. "Getting there. It's weird having an office instead of a hangar." "You miss flying?" It wasn't a question. "Every day. But this matters too. Maybe more." He nodded. "You're doing good work, Kane. Changing things. People notice, some people resist. They always do. But resistance means you're pushing boundaries that need pushing. Keep going." That conversation stayed with me through the harder days, when resistance felt overwhelming and progress felt impossible. Change was happening. Slowly, imperfectly, but happening. The Navy wasn't perfect. The special operations community wasn't perfect. But it was better than it had been 6 months ago. And it would be better 6 months from now. That had to be enough. Respect earned through results, not rank. That was the standard I set for myself and everyone under my command. And slowly, grudgingly, the culture began to shift. Months later, at a Navy gala in Washington, Cole approached me. The event was formal, dress uniforms, senior leadership from across the military, the kind of obligatory networking that comes with rank. I was standing near the bar, nursing a drink and making small talk with Captain Lawson about budget allocations, when I saw Cole making his way through the crowd. No smirk, no swagger, just a man carrying the weight of his own pride. He'd aged in the months since I'd seen him. More gray at the temples, lines around his eyes deeper. He looked like someone who'd been doing hard internal work and wasn't quite finished. "Commander Kane," he said. "Could I have a moment?" Lawson caught my eye, offering a subtle escape route if I wanted it. I shook my head slightly. "Of course, Admiral." We moved to a quieter corner away from the main crowd. Cole held his drink, but didn't sip it. Just used it as something to do with his hands. "I didn't know," he said finally. "If I had, you would have treated me differently," I finished. "That's the point." He nodded slowly. "You are the one who saved my men. I served with 3 of those guys in an earlier deployment. Johnson and Peters, the men I lost. They were part of the same battalion, different op, but same time frame. When I heard about the ridge extraction, about some pilot pulling off the impossible when everyone else had given up, I felt, I don't know, angry maybe. Like, why couldn't that pilot have been there for my team? Why did some operators get miracles while mine got body bags? I'd suspected something like this, but hearing it confirmed was different. You resented me before you even met me. I resented what you represented. Success where I'd experienced failure. Competence in the exact area where I felt most powerless. And when he turned out to be a woman, he trailed off. It confirmed all your biases, I said. Made it easier to dismiss me. If I was just playing it soldier, then your failure wasn't really about the impossible odds or bad luck. It was about not having someone good enough. And if I wasn't actually good, then neither was the pilot who couldn't save your men. That's pretty much it. Ugly, but accurate. It is ugly. We stood in silence for a moment. Around us, the gala continued. Officers networking, telling war stories, building careers through conversation. The world kept turning while we dealt with the wreckage of past mistakes. Your men saved themselves, I said finally. The ones from Rich. I just flew the bird. They kept their heads under fire, loaded wounded efficiently, provided suppressing fire when we needed it. They did everything right. I got them out because they made it possible. You're being modest again. I'm being accurate. Good outcomes require everyone doing their part. I can fly through hell, but if the team on the ground falls apart, we all die. Your men, Johnson and Peters, I'm guessing they did everything right too. Sometimes the odds are just impossible. And competence isn't enough. Cole looked down at his drink. The pilot who flew that mission, he retired 6 months later. Couldn't live with it. I blamed him for years. Thought he choked, made the wrong call, wasn't tough enough. But I read the after-action report again recently. Really read it. Not just looking for someone to blame. The conditions were impossible. He made 3 attempts to reach them. Took fire that damaged his aircraft. Nearly crashed twice. He did everything humanly possible. It just wasn't enough. And you're realizing that now? I'm realizing that I've spent years being angry at the wrong people. At pilots who flew impossible missions, at you for succeeding where others failed, at myself for not being able to control outcomes that were never controllable. It's been educational. There was something almost broken in his voice. This wasn't the charismatic commander who'd walked into that briefing room months ago. This was someone who'd been forced to confront fundamental truths about himself and hadn't liked what he'd found. I'm trying to do better, he said. I've been mentoring younger officers, women included, quietly. No speeches, no grand gestures, just trying to make sure they don't face the garbage you faced from me. I heard Ensign Harper mentioned you advocated for her during a recent evaluation dispute. He looked surprised. She told you that? She's one of mine. I keep track. She's good. Talented pilot, sharp tactical mind. Reminded me a bit of you, actually. That made me uncomfortable at first, like the universe was forcing me to confront my mistakes repeatedly. But then I realized that was exactly what I needed. Growth is uncomfortable, I said. So I'm learning. He paused. I'm retiring officially. Putting in my papers next month. Voluntary mostly. My boss suggested it might be time, and he wasn't wrong. I've done what I can do in this role. Time to make space for someone without my baggage. He smiled. Sad, self-aware. Besides, I'm tired. Tired of fighting the wrong battles, carrying the wrong grudges. Maybe it's time to figure out who I am without the uniform. I didn't know what to say to that. Part of me felt something like pity. Here was a man whose career was ending not with glory, but with quiet resignation, pushed out by his own failures. Part of me felt it was deserved, that consequences were appropriate. Both things were true simultaneously. I hope you find what you're looking for, I said finally. I hope I figure out what that is first. He finished his drink, set the glass on a passing waiter's tray. For what it's worth, Kane, you're exactly what this community needs. Someone who leads with competence instead of ego. Someone who makes space for others instead of taking all the oxygen. I wish I'd been smart enough to see that from the beginning. Maybe you'll take that lesson with you. Apply it wherever you end up next. That's the plan. He extended his hand. I looked at it for a moment. This man who'd mocked me, diminished me, tried to block my career. The man who was now acknowledging his failures and trying, however imperfectly, to be better. I shook his hand. Good luck, Admiral. You too, Commander. Though something tells me you won't need it. He walked away, disappearing into the crowd. I watched him go, feeling something complex and unnameable. Not forgiveness exactly, that felt too generous for the months of disrespect and the damage that had rippled outward from his behavior. But acknowledgement. The recognition that people could change, could grow, could confront their worst instincts and choose something better. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all anyone could ask. Captain Lawson reappeared at my elbow. That looked intense. It was. He's retiring. I heard. Good riddance, some were saying, but I don't know. Seemed like maybe he learned something. Maybe. Time will tell if it sticks. What about you? How are you doing with all this? I considered the question. Better. Not perfect, but better. I'm doing work. That matters. Making changes that needed making. Some days are harder than others, but I'm not carrying around the weight I used to. The weight of trying to prove yourself. The weight of believing I had to accept disrespect as the price of admission. I don't believe that anymore. Lawson raised his glass. To that, I clinked mine against his. Around us, the gala continued. The Navy's elite celebrating themselves, telling stories, building legacies. I was part of that now, visibly and undeniably, not as someone's token, not as an exception that proved the rule, but as a leader who'd earned her place and was using it to make things better for those who came after. That was enough. That was everything. Years later, during a ceremony at the Pentagon, I stood on the stage as my name was read for promotion to captain. The room was filled with senior officers, family members, colleagues from throughout my career. My parents sat in the front row, my father in his old Navy uniform, still crisp despite decades in storage, my mother wiping tears she'd probably deny later. Lieutenant Commander Sandra Kane, the presiding officer, announced, for distinguished service in Special Operations Aviation, demonstrating exceptional leadership, tactical excellence, and unwavering commitment to the mission, is hereby promoted to the rank of Captain, United States Navy. The audience applauded. I stepped forward as Colonel Hayes, the Pentagon officer overseeing the ceremony, prepared to pin the new insignia. In the audience, toward the back, I spotted Admiral Cole in civilian clothes. Retired now, no longer part of the official Navy family, but he'd come anyway. Our eyes met briefly. He nodded, respectful, acknowledging. I nodded back. When they pinned the insignia, I didn't think of him, or the briefing room, or the laughter. I thought of the missions, the silence before takeoff, the hum of engines vibrating through my chest, the weight of responsibility that came with every flight. I thought of the men I brought home, the operators who trusted me with their lives, the pilots I trained who were now executing their own impossible missions. I thought of Lieutenant Alvarez, who'd been my co-pilot through the hardest nights and was now commanding his own aviation unit. Of Chief Miller, retired but present in the audience, probably critiquing the ceremony's maintenance of traditions. Of Ensign Harper, now a lieutenant herself, flying ops in the Pacific with the confidence and competence I'd hoped to instill. I thought of Kandahar, of Helmand Ridge, of storm winds and zero visibility, and the certainty that we weren't going to make it, followed by the stubborn refusal to accept that certainty. I thought of every mission where competence had been enough, where the odds had been beaten, not through miracles, but through preparation, skill, and the collective effort of professionals doing their jobs. Respect isn't given and it isn't taken. It's earned in the dark when no one's watching. It's earned through consistency, through showing up day after day and doing the work, regardless of whether anyone notices or cares. It's earned through making others better, creating space for excellence, setting standards that elevate everyone around you. The ceremony concluded with the traditional reception. Officers congratulated me, shared stories about missions we'd flown together, talked about the future of Special Operations Aviation. I moved through the conversations with practiced ease, balancing humility and confidence, acknowledging contributions while accepting credit where it was due. Lieutenant Harper, now an instructor herself, approached with a group of younger pilots. Captain Kane, she said formally, then grinned. Still sounds weird. Feels weird, I admitted. Give me a few weeks. These are some of the new pilots rotating through advanced training, Harper continued. They wanted to meet you. They've been studying your Helmand Ridge approach in their tactical courses. The young pilots, 3 men and 2 women, all in their early 20s with the eager competence of people who've proven themselves, but haven't been tested by real chaos yet, looked at me with the same mixture of awe and curiosity I'd seen countless times since that briefing room reveal. Helmand Ridge was a long time ago, I said. What matters more is what you're learning now, how you'll apply it tomorrow. But the approach vector you used, one of the male pilots said, threading between those ridge lines in zero visibility, that's impossible without GPS. And yours was damaged. It was damaged, not destroyed. We had partial function, and we had terrain maps memorized, compass navigation, and basic dead reckoning. Technology makes things easier, but you can't rely on it completely. What happens when it fails? You fly by instinct, one of the female pilots said. You fly by training, I corrected. Instinct gets you killed. Training, repeated until it's automatic. Practiced until you can do it in your sleep. That's what saves you when everything goes wrong. We talked for a while about tactics, about the evolution of Special Operations Aviation, about the balance between following protocols and adapting to chaos. These young pilots would face challenges I'd never imagined, would fly missions in contexts I couldn't predict. But if I'd done my job, if the systems I'd helped build and the culture I'd worked to change had taken root, they'd face those challenges from a position of equality, judged on competence rather than demographics. As the reception wound down, I found a moment of quiet on a balcony overlooking the Pentagon grounds. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the parade grounds. I heard footsteps behind me and turned to find my father. Captain Kane, he said, voice thick with emotion. Never thought I'd see the day. You taught me to take apart an engine before I learned to drive, I said. This is your fault. He laughed, pulled me into a hug. Your mother's beside herself. She's already planning the party, calling everyone we've ever known. Of course she is. We stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun sink lower. Finally, he said, "You know what I'm proudest of?" "What?" "Not the rank. Not the missions, though incredible. I'm proud that you changed things. That you made it a little bit easier for the people coming after you. That's real leadership." I felt tears threaten and pushed them back. "I'm still figuring it out. We all are. But you're doing it right." The ceremony had been about promotion, about recognition, about advancement through ranks. But the real measure of success wasn't the insignia on my collar. It was the young pilots who'd studied tactics without being told their gender made them less capable. It was the commanders who'd learned to evaluate competence objectively. It was the slow, grinding progress toward a military that judged people by their abilities rather than their demographics. Now, when young recruits ask about call signs, I tell them the truth. They're not nicknames, they're promises. Promises that you'll show up when it matters. That you'll execute when conditions are impossible. That you'll bring people home when everyone else has given up. Reaper Zero was a promise I'd made one night in Kandahar and kept through hundreds of missions since. It was a promise I'd extend to every pilot I trained, every operator I supported, every mission I commanded. And every time someone says Reaper Zero, I remember the moment a room full of men learned that sometimes the quietest soldier in the room is the one you should never underestimate. I remember the years of proving myself, the moment of revelation, the long work of rebuilding systems that had failed not just me, but countless others. I remember that respect is earned through consistency, that leadership is measured by the people you elevate, and that real change comes not from one dramatic moment, but from 1,000 small choices to do better. The sun finished setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Inside, the ceremony continued: networking, stories, celebration. Tomorrow, I'd return to work with new responsibilities, new challenges, new opportunities to shape the future of Special Operations Aviation. But tonight, standing on this balcony with my father beside me and the weight of new insignia on my shoulders, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. Not for what I'd achieved, but for what came next. For the work still to be done, the system still to be improved, the people still to be supported. Leadership without integrity corrodes the mission. I'd seen it, fought it, and worked to replace it with something better. That work would never be finished, but it was work worth doing, and I was exactly where I needed to be to do it. The call came on a Wednesday morning, 3 years into my command. I was reviewing flight schedules when my assistant knocked on the office door. "Captain, you have a visitor. Says it's personal." I looked up from the paperwork. "Who?" "Admiral Cole's daughter, Emily Cole." I hadn't heard that name in years. Cole himself had passed away 6 months ago, heart attack, sudden and final. I'd sent flowers to the funeral, but hadn't attended. Our relationship had ended at that gala years ago, with a handshake and mutual understanding. I'd assumed that was the last chapter. "Send her in." The woman who entered was in her mid-20s, wearing civilian clothes, jeans and a navy sweatshirt. She had her father's eyes, that same intensity, but something softer in her expression. She clutched a leather folder against her chest like armor. "Captain Kane, thank you for seeing me. I'm Emily Cole. I know this is unexpected. Please sit down." I gestured to the chair across from my desk. "I'm sorry about your father." "Thank you." She sat, still holding the folder. "I'm not sure how to start this." "Start anywhere. Take your time." She took a breath. "My father talked about you a lot in his last years. After he retired, he did consulting work, leadership development, military transition programs. But privately, he kept journals, reflections on his career, his mistakes, lessons he wished he'd learned earlier." She placed the folder on the desk. "He asked me to give you this. After he died, he was very specific about it." I looked at the folder but didn't touch it. "What is it?" "Letters to you. He wrote them over the course of 2 years, but never sent them. He said you'd earned the right to know the full story, but he didn't want to burden you with it while he was alive. He was afraid it would seem like he was asking for forgiveness he didn't deserve." My throat tightened. "Emily, I read them," she interrupted. "He told me I could. They're about the men he lost, about his failures, about you, about how meeting you changed his understanding of leadership. He called you the best officer he'd ever served with, even though you were never technically under his command." She pushed the folder toward me. "I think he needed you to know that. That you mattered. That what you did, not just in missions, but in how you handled him, made a difference." I opened the folder. Inside were handwritten letters, pages of them. Cole's distinctive angular handwriting filling every sheet. The first one was dated 2 months after his retirement. "Commander Kane, I'm writing this knowing I'll probably never send it. Cowardice, maybe, or respect for the boundaries you've set. But I need to say these things, even if only to paper. The men I lost, Johnson and Peters, haunt me still. Not because I failed them tactically, but because I let their deaths poison everything that came after. I made their sacrifice about my pain instead of their service. I stopped reading, looked up at Emily. Why no? Why not just let it rest? Because he wanted you to know that people can change. That accountability isn't just about punishment or consequences. It's about becoming better. He spent his last years trying to be better. Teaching young officers, advocating for equity in military leadership, mentoring women and minorities entering special operations. He never did it publicly. Never took credit. He said he didn't deserve credit for doing what should have been basic decency. I know about some of that work, I said quietly. I heard he was helping veterans transition to civilian leadership roles, that he was good at it. He was. He found purpose in it.